They are so upset at me. She abandoned us. How could she? And I mean, some of my kids I just had to block because of the kind of messages they sent me. One of my sons got married recently and I went to the wedding. But at the wedding, one of my sons just started kicking me. Like they couldn't stand that I was there. And it was like whichever room I went into, they all like left. And then I went to, and it was just like this kind of situation. It's very, very painful. In 2019, I filed a case against New York City, New York State, and my son's school for not providing him with an education.
Wow.
This was, an issue that's been ongoing forever, but it's absolutely illegal what they do. They take money from the government, they market themselves as a school, and then they basically don't teach them any general subjects. All day religious studies, and then like, if you're lucky, one class at the end of the day for an hour on like math and reading. 3 years later, I won the case.
That's amazing.
They agreed. But the crazy thing was, family court still made me keep him there. So you have New York State Department of Education saying this school is like not okay, and the family court judge is saying you have to send him there. They don't care. They're like willing to throw these kids under the bus for their political aspiration. Once you leave, especially once you complain against the school, it's like you become the targeted one. Like you're the one that's being followed. You're the one that they're checking out where you are and what you're doing. If every woman that was in an abusive marriage in that community was like, I had enough, I'm not putting up with this, the whole system would disintegrate.
It would collapse without the
women. It would collapse. My story terrifies people.
Hey, my name is Shalise Ansola, and this is Cults to Consciousness, where we discuss leaving high-demand religions or organizations and finding healing and independence through awareness and true individual sovereignty. If you're only listening and you'd like to see our faces, go to our YouTube channel at Cults to Consciousness, where you can join in on the conversation. We love seeing those words of encouragement down there for our guests who are bravely coming on and sharing their stories. They're being vulnerable. Remember, guys, these are real people who are sharing with us so that we can become more aware of these groups and become more compassionate to those who are still involved. Today's guest, we've had her on before. We didn't nearly get through her story all the way. We had so much more to cover, and so I wanted to do a second episode with her. We are talking about her life leaving the Hasidic ultra-Orthodox community in New York. She had 10 children, what it was like to separate from her husband, how the courts were involved, really just how it was deconstructing and becoming who she is today, which is a speaker, an activist. She's done a TED Talk, highly recommend. So we are bringing back to the channel, thank you so much for joining us, Beatrice Weber.
So good to be here with you again, Shalise. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, of course. Thank you for being willing to continue the conversation after an hour and a half already.
Yeah, I'm thinking about that process, right, of like the after, which is 10 years, right? I left just over 10 years ago, April 2014, and how much has changed since then during that time. I couldn't have imagined it 10 years ago.
Yeah.
No way.
Yeah, it's wild. And it's one of those things we always talk about. You don't realize how far you've come until you look back and you recognize the ways in which you were living previously and kind of the control that you were under. And so I tell everyone, even if it's a baby step of just changing your mindset a little bit is such a huge win when you grow up in a certain community that tells you how to think, tells you how to be, act, dress, the whole thing. So let's just give, for those who aren't familiar, you don't have to go back and watch the first episode before you start this one, but just like a little bit of what we talked about. I would say you grew up in Canada, actually, in a specific Hasidic community that was even more strict than others. And this is, again, a disclaimer that we are not lumping everyone who is part of Hasidic communities into her experience. This is Beatrice's experience only, and there are many different factions and levels of how people decide to practice things. You got pulled out of school at 16, sent abroad to a seminary because you were misbehaving, or at least according to them. And then right when you came back, got married and went to Israel, started having children immediately. You were in a marriage that was not good for you. You were depressed, going to therapy, and started to realize, wow, I cannot be in this marriage anymore, with no intention of leaving the community, knew you had to escape your marriage with the children that you could leave with. So we just left off in the previous episode. You leave in the middle of the night with 4 of your children. You land at your brother's house And you get there right at the perfect timing because he wasn't allowed to use his cell phone during a specific holiday. And right when the holiday is over, he's saying, "You're not safe here anymore. I can't protect you." Was that a good enough description? Did I miss anything? Did I say anything wrong?
That was
great. Okay. So the cliffhanger moment, you're like, okay, how do I keep my children? Because if my husband comes, I'm not going to be able to keep them from going with him.
So that's when I realized, I would have to involve the court system, something that I didn't think. And in fact, I actually called a rabbi and said, what should I do? I'm scared. And the rabbi was like, well, I tell my people if they're scared, they're allowed to go to court, which was like, oh, okay. I thought that was, I didn't expect to hear that from a rabbi. So that's what I did. The very next day, I took my kids with me, went back to where I was living, right? Because I had gone to a different state to spend the holiday with my brother, went back, and oh my gosh, there's supposed to be somebody to help you fill out those forms. I didn't have a lawyer. I didn't have anything, but nobody was around, and I was just, I am going to get this done. So then I filled out the paperwork and got temporary, both order of protection and temporary custody, which meant nobody could come take the kids. And now I had custody. And in fact, I found out later that over the holiday, 2 of my older children had walked like 5 miles to a different community because they thought that I was there to look for me. I remember she told me, like, my old boss where I worked at, they were soaking wet and drenched. Their father had sent them like to look to find me. So there was a real danger of, someone coming to take the kids away. That was, I would say, one of the scariest things I did. I also, took orders of protection against my 2 older sons because I was scared.
Really? How old were they?
They were older, like 18 and 20. So they were older already, and I was afraid of them. They had been threatening me before I left, and I was really afraid. And I was lucky that I was able to get that temporarily. But the way it works is you have to go back a week later. And by that time, that's when, like, my brother was like, listen, if you go do that, you can't stay here any longer. I reached out to my parents. Can you help me? I'm going to have to hire a lawyer. They were like, no, if you're sick, go to a hospital. That was like very clear that if I was going to court, this was going to be completely on my own. I did it. And I am so grateful. Like, I think back to those times when I was so alone and so afraid and still very much part of the community. So afraid of the repercussions. I had a job by then, which was great, but it wasn't like, I wasn't making a ton of money. It was like a simple job, but I'm so proud of myself, that I had the courage to do it anyway.
Yeah. So you said you had left with 4 children and you had to leave some of the older ones behind. What were kind of their ages so I have an idea?
So the youngest one I left was almost 14.
Okay.
So the oldest one was married. She was 21. So they were between the ages of 21 and 14.
Okay. So we're not leaving with toddlers. They're older children.
Those were the ones I left. The ones I took were between the ages of 12 and a year and a half.
Oh, got it. Okay, so you were leaving with toddlers.
Oh, I took the toddlers, yes.
Okay.
And I would try to take the 13-year-old. I woke him up and I begged him to come with me. I said, we're just going away for the holiday. And he just couldn't meet my eyes. And he was like, I need to stay. I'm already a man. He had already had his bar mitzvah the year before. I need to stay with my father for the holiday. I can't come. But interestingly, he didn't wake anybody up and tell them I was leaving. So I think he was torn, but it's a real source of pain, for those children, even though I tell myself, and I know it's true, that me leaving and them seeing me have a voice, accomplish things, get a college degree, everything I've done, I feel like it's given them a little bit more choices within the community, even though they're still part of it, but it's a lot of pain.
Mm-hmm. That must have been incredibly difficult for you to have to leave some of them behind, knowing the life that they were a part of and the life that you were hoping for them.
Yeah, and I think by now I've kind of processed that already, but for many years I really kind of blamed myself. Why didn't I leave earlier? Or why couldn't I have done something different? But really being able to kind of embrace the fact that I was in an impossible situation. It was impossible. Like the months before I left, it was like I had one of my sisters would call me and talk to me, and then she'd tell her husband what I said, who would tell my husband, and then like my cleaning lady was talking to my mother-in-law and telling her what was going on. I was like trapped from like all sides. Wow. So the fact that I was actually able to leave, like that's what I realize now. The fact that I was able to leave and able to keep, most of the children with me was really not to be taken for granted.
Yeah. When you were granted temporary custody from the family court, was that supposed to include all of the children under 18?
When I went, I was just for the younger children.
Okay.
It would just let me just keep the younger children. By then, I had gotten visitation with one of the older children, the 13-year-old, and that lasted for a couple of months. But I felt like the anger that the older children were already having towards me, it would not be useful or helpful for me to fight for custody. And if I was able to keep these children, I'd be happy. And, when I got to court, I came myself. I managed to raise money from a couple of friends, so I was able to hire an attorney. And I was met with a lot of people came to support, my then husband. It's like my father came from Canada, my older kids came, a brother-in-law came, a son-in-law came. It was it's meant to intimidate me. But I think ultimately it helped me, because I think basically what I was saying was, I'm being bullied, I'm being harassed. All I want is to have some peace with me and these children. And then when he came with kind of this whole display of like, I don't know, maybe like 10 people with him, it really didn't look good. I mean, we had to still kind of fight for it. It was still only temporary, but eventually I did get custody of those 4 children. But then I made a huge mistake, which again, like I don't blame myself for it now because that's where I was then. But what happened was, I spent the $20,000 in like a month. Family court's extremely expensive. And my parents, who I was still speaking to, even though my father came to court with my ex-husband, were like, why don't you work out the rest with the rabbis? If you do that, we'll pay for everything. You won't have to worry. And I believed that the rabbis would support me, because I believed that they knew that he was abusive and that they knew that it was okay for me to leave him and live my life. And I trusted. Because I had been raised in a family that was very highly regarded in the community, for the most part, we were like protected from, or at least I didn't experience some of the corruption and abuse. Because like if I want to get my kid into school, I just had to call a few people and was able to get them into a school. Like if I wanted a job, I had the connections and the relationships because of kind of the status of my family. But when I started working with the rabbis, it was terrible. I can't even describe the manipulation, but they were like, we're going to send you to a psychiatrist to evaluate you, but it has to be our psychiatrist. It was an awful year and a half of them trying to make money, basically, hearing me tell my story. But eventually, after a year and a half, they ruled that my ex-husband should get all the children.
Oh my gosh.
And the way these rabbis do it, they make you sign an arbitration agreement. And I didn't really realize what I was signing. And they wrote up the kind of ruling in a way that would be considered acceptable to the court. But I mean, they didn't say anything about him, but for me, they're like, she's a member of Footsteps. She's part of Toastmasters. Like you can imagine, she's friends with this person. She's friends with that person. She's a terrible mother. She's this, she's that. It was like, it painted me like in the worst light possible. The good thing is that in New York State, they don't automatically take the recommendation of an arbitration for custody. So when he went back to court to get it signed off on, they were like, 1 second, when she was here a year and a half ago, we gave her custody. We're not just signing this. You guys have to come back. So I took back my lawyer, who happened to have been one of the top lawyers up there, which was amazing. And he represented me, and I was able to keep the children. But it was impossible. Ultimately, we settled. About a half a year later, he wanted to get married. So he knew that I wouldn't give up the kids. So he settled with me, and I retained custody of the kids. But I had to commit to raising them completely Orthodox. I had to commit to keeping them in Hasidic schools. There was no other way. Like, there was no question. At that point, even though I was still part of the community, I was definitely a little more open. I would have wanted something a little more, but I knew that if I want to get this signed, I'm going to have to commit to all those things. That was signed off by the court. That was 2016. So that's what I ended up with, this agreement.
So can we get into that a little bit? Because when we interviewed Chavie, it seemed like something similar happened. And that was just the mass outrage in the comments, was how this couldn't have been a secular judge who said that the kids had to remain religious even though Chavie was no longer, and she was forced to dress that way when she went into the communities. And it just feels like there's something going on there. So let's dive into that a little bit.
So I will say that Chavie's case was ultimately appealed, and because of her case, things are a little better now.
Okay.
So shout out to Chavie.
Yes.
She's one of the people that she appealed the case. And then, and then there are several others that also, that it's much better now than it was 10 years ago.
Okay.
Much better. So first of all, I had the advantage of having a good lawyer. So when you have a really good lawyer who knows how to work the judge, you're always, that helps always. So he kind of didn't let her get away with it. For a while, I had a pro bono lawyer. At some point in the middle, that was later on, because I've been in court for 10 years. And that was you had the rabbis testifying, saying since she started uncovering her hair, that's when the kids started showing these kind of behaviors. It was ridiculous. The school where my son went to set up a computer in the school office for people to come testify on my ex-husband's behalf.
Oh,
it's just terrible. But then I took back my other lawyer, and he's like, let's stop with all this. Let's do a psychological. Okay. And the thing is, my ex is absolutely certain that I'm quote unquote crazy. And the judge was kind of too. So they were like, oh yeah, great, let's do it. But ultimately I did very well. I did reasonably well. So it was the judge was like, oh, okay, I guess I won't be able to do something so blatant as to take away custody, because she did take away custody. I lost custody of my little one in 2021 for a week. But this is, again, he wasn't feeling well. He was diagnosed with celiac, so he was out of school for, just over a week. And then I moved away from where I'd been living because I had started being stalked and followed. Based on that, she removed custody from me. But again, I was lucky. I had this good lawyer. I was able to raise money, so we were able to appeal it, which cost $30,000.
Oh my gosh.
Right? Able to appeal it, and he came back. My son talks about that week. He's like, I was crying and crying, and they knew I was crying, and they didn't do anything. It was just awful. And she just took away custody, and didn't even set up a visitation plan. Didn't set up anything, but ultimately that switched back. So since then, the judge has been a little careful. But I will say, it's just been horrific. And I want to talk a little bit about kind of the education component of all this.
Yeah.
Because that's the work I got involved with. So I'll just say that my experience with the rabbis showed me a side to the community that I could not ignore anymore. I could not ignore anymore the corruption and the manipulation. And that was oh my gosh, I got to heal from all this, right? I have to heal. I need to get past this. And how I cannot heal when I live under those belief systems that God will punish me for X, Y, Z. So it wasn't even that I had completely deconstructed my belief system yet, but I knew that I could not continue living. And that's when I 2018, I was like, you know what? I need to live a different way. It was very scary. So scary. But also freeing. I'll say I'll never forget that first Friday night going to a Broadway show with like my hair uncovered, right? Because I had like started growing out my hair, but I was still covering it. So the first time I uncovered my hair and like walked down the street just was like, it's just so freeing,
Wow. And you got great hair.
Thank you.
Side note, it should be uncovered. It's great hair.
I like shaved it for 20 years.
Oh my gosh, that's wild.
So when I started wearing my hair, I like dyed it and straightened it. And then I was like, no, like this is just me, this is my hair. This is me.
Yeah. Isn't it interesting that something so simple as hair, it's a part of you, it's just part of your being, just completely unlocked something for you and you were able to just allow yourself to be.
It's so symbolic to me for my, for my freedom, like my hair. It's very symbolic for me. And also think about being forced to shave your head for 20 years, every month, a couple of days before I went to the ritual bath, right? Shave it all off. Just.
Yeah. So what's happening in your mind, like going through all these court battles and trying to figure out how you want to live, if you want to remain Hasidic, if you want to remain in the faith at all, and your kids are being taken away and given back, and just all of this chaos. How are you able to just kind of come to the surface and realize what it is that you want? How are you able to find clarity?
That's a really good question. Well, once I finished with the rabbis, I was able to reflect a little bit about what I experienced when leaving and in my marriage. Like, I was determined to heal. Even though now, 10 years later, I'm like, you never really heal. It's a process. It's waves. It's healing. It's a journey. But I was like, I deserve a better life. And I will do whatever I can to give myself a better life. Like, that was huge for me to be able to own that and say that. And I think till today, that's something, because when you live in such a community for decades, like, I still sometimes do things that are not necessarily the best for me. And then it's like, oh, okay. Like, I still will sometimes veer towards extremism, for lack of a better word, because I'm so used to it. It's so like part of my bones, But today I catch myself and I'm like, whoa, that doesn't work. And I'm able to remove myself.
Mm-hmm.
But definitely, I would say a big part of kind of the activism that I'm involved with, which, I'll be quite frank, I took a huge step back from. For 3 years, in 2019, I filed a case against New York City, New York State, and my son's school for not providing him with an education.
Wow.
This was, an issue that's been ongoing forever, but it's absolutely illegal what they do. They take money from the government, they market themselves as a school, private school, but still a school, and then they basically don't teach them any general subjects and spend practically all the time on religious subjects. Okay, like you have Catholic schools, let's say, in New York City, that they have a class on religion once a day or whatever, and the rest of the time is regular studies. No, that's not what this is like. This is like all day religious studies, and then like, if you're lucky, one class at the end of the day for an hour on like math and reading. Then the people who teach you come from the community and can barely read themselves. Like, that's what it looks like. In high school, there's nothing for the boys. So I filed this case. And my motivation with filing this case was, first of all, I wanted him to get an education. I had somebody that didn't graduate high school, had an MBA, had a career by then, really wanted him to get an education. And also I knew that the second of my sons who had lived with me had left his father. And I knew the impact of going to these schools is more than just lack of education. It's also being immersed in a culture that basically says that somebody who leaves is liable for the death penalty, right? So to keep him in such a school is terrible for so many levels, like both the educational and the psychological and emotional.
Yeah.
So 3 years later, I won the case.
That's amazing.
I won the case. And they agreed. But the crazy thing was, family court still made me keep him there. So you have New York State Department of Education saying this school is like not okay, and the family court judge is saying you have to send him there.
Did they give you a reason? Was it just they didn't want to disrupt his life?
There's no reason. It's just not wanting to disrupt their relationship with the community. It's very little about the well-being of the child.
Yeah.
Judges are voted in by the community. They have deep relationships. They don't want to rock the boat. It's all political.
Yeah.
Even this whole fight about education. So I later became the executive director, doing this work full time. And the politics are so messy, and it's so not fair. People are willing to throw these kids, and this is tens of thousands of kids across the state, right? It's a lot of kids. They don't care. They're like willing to throw these kids under the bus for their political aspirations. So it's been really awful seeing it. 2 months ago, I took a huge step back, and now I am a senior advisor at the organization and work part-time. Like doing it full-time was just like, it's too much. It's too close, too much. But ultimately, I was able to send my son to another school because the school refused to take him back.
What? Why?
Well, they said he wasn't happy, whatever. But really, they wanted me out of their hair because they were not planning on complying with the state, and they didn't want a parent who complains in the school.
Whoa.
But what happened was the family court judge, at the beginning of the school year, still was forcing me to send him there. And they refused to take him. So my son was out of school for the first month of the school year, until finally they subpoenaed the school administrator to come. So the school administrator gets there and trying to figure out, did I refuse to send him there, right? Because they were saying, yo, she's not sending. I'm like, they don't let me. Anyway, so the judge is like, well, what date did school start? And she's like, oh, there's a calendar behind you if you need to refer to. He could not tell the judge which date school started, even with a calendar. And he's like, oh, I don't see Rosh Hashanah on it, so I don't know. It was just like, and the things he said, it was like, listen, if she wants, she can send the child, but she can never complain about anything. Whatever we say the child needs to do, if we need to give extra tutoring or we need to give extra help for the child, she needs to agree to everything. There's no way. But then he was like, also like, I don't speak to the father because he's angry at me and he doesn't speak nicely to me. So at some point the judge was just like, okay, whatever. The way my agreement was written up was like, if we can't agree, the parent, it was complicated. But ultimately my son is in an amazing progressive Jewish school where he's getting an education.
That's so great. We did a whole episode with someone named Yohanan where he was suing the Quebec government for the same thing, where he's like, they're not learning in these schools. And so what actually came of that though? So you sued and you won. Did they actually implement change? Were they forced to?
Right now, the law changed, or it didn't change, but it became firmed up in the state. And by the end of the next school year, technically speaking, all non-public schools in New York State need to be up to standard. Otherwise, they're going to get shut down or they'll remove their funding.
Yeah.
So yeah, we did a lot. Like we accomplished a lot. Like my son accomplished that. They don't want him back, so he goes to a good school. But yes, the entire state has to change. So it's mainly like the Hasidic schools are the bulk of it, and there are some Amish schools like further up north that are also going to have to change.
That's great.
It's not going to be easy, but they're definitely moving towards that.
Yeah, that's huge. That's huge.
It's so not fair. Like for me, let's say I was pulled out of school when I was 16, but at least I was taught how to read and write. So when I wanted to go to college later on, I was able to catch up. But you have these kids that can't read or write an essay, don't even know what an essay is. The things I could tell, it's like, so my son, he likes to learn, so he knew all about the solar system. And one day, they don't learn any science, but one day the teacher was like, tell them the earth is in the middle and everything revolves around it. And my son like raised his hand and was like, that's not how the solar system works. And proceeded to explain to him. So my son's like 7 years old, 8 years old, talking to his teacher. Okay. And I'm like, wasn't the teacher upset at you? Like you're contradicting. And he's like, no, the teacher said that he never learned it before. And he was so curious. It's just like ridiculously sad,
Yeah.
But it's people like, it's so easy, especially the Hasidic community, right? Now I'll send you pictures, the men are wearing the side curls and the hats. It's like so easy to look at them and be like, they're just different. No, they're not different. They're humans. They're people who have the same right to, freedom to choose their life, but they're deprived. And you have the double layer because they're Jewish. People don't want to talk about it. It's just awful. And I don't know, hopefully there'll be that change with at least the schools, which will
Right.
Give people opportunities.
How were your children handling all of this? The back and forth? Were they forced to go and see their dad at some point? How are they acclimating to this huge change?
So I think it's interesting because kids change a lot better like than you think, right? So my little one, I was a year and a half. So he always, even though I changed, I always had an openness and acceptance of like everybody and everything. So he kind of grew up with that and was used to that. The challenge is, I don't think the challenge is the difference in lifestyle. The challenge is he goes back and he hears bad things about me. There's a lot of judgment. Then he has to come back and kind of figure it out. But my attitude is very much like these kids grew up a certain way. That's what they know, and if that's what they choose to do, I respect that. I'm proud of my daughters. Two of them have a college degree. Some of them have their own businesses. Like they're having children a lot slower. Like one of my daughters had her first one like 3.5 years after she was married, not like 10 months. So there's a little bit of, even though like they are so upset at me. Like, first of all, it was like, she abandoned us. And then it's like, how could she? And I mean, mostly my sons, but sometimes my daughter. I mean, some of my kids I just had to block because of the kind of messages they sent me. One of my sons got married recently and I went to the wedding. But at the wedding, one of my sons just started kicking me. Like they couldn't stand that I was there. It's very, very painful.
Yeah. Have you ever been able to have a real conversation with those older kids who you had to leave behind and explain?
I would love to.
Yeah.
I would love the opportunity for that. Right now, there's just like so much. Like, I was at this wedding and, I didn't cover my hair, but I wore a modest dress and whatever. This was one of the sons who lived with me, like the oldest, that was 12, was 22, and he was getting married. And he's kind of at the edge of the community, but his wedding was in the Hasidic community. And it was like, whichever room I went into, they all like left. And then I went to, and it was just like this kind of situation where, at one point there was a back and forth with one of my children. And she's like, well, if you would just sit down with a professional with me. I'm like, of course I would. Of course. I think it's especially for children who grew up it was an abusive environment, and I've written about that, how I was complicit in that. When you're married to an abusive man and you let certain things slide, like the way my kids were punished and the way they were spoken to, as much as I tried to protect them, I was still the adult in the room, and I remember my therapist telling me, like, when I left, she's like, this is the first time you're really acting like a mother. You're taking a stand for your children. But that was like after 22 years. For children to really be able to look at that reality, especially when they're part of a community like this, I don't know. I hope they do.
Yeah, that's hard because they would have to admit a lot about the entire system, because you really have to take a broader perspective of it. It's not just an individual situation. It's the systems in place that allow and encourage this type of behavior.
Yes. And like, my children don't want to see themselves as being oppressed in the community. Do I believe they are? Of course I believe they are. I always say, no child wakes up and no child is born and says, my dream life is, getting married at 18 and having to cover my hair for the rest of my life. Nobody says that. I believe that it's an oppressive community that people are stuck in and stay. Do I think people can't be happy in the community? Of course they could. But it's, on the whole, an oppressive community. Do they want to see that? I think that's there's a lot of comfort in staying in the place you were raised. And people reach out to me and ask me, and it's not an easy journey. Mm-hmm. I am grateful for every single day of my freedom. And some of the days are hard. I will say that. Some of the days are really hard. But there's not a day that I'm not grateful for the fact that I have my freedom. I have my freedom. I'm my own person. I don't have the fear. I'm not afraid that I'm going to do something wrong and I'm going to get punished, or that something bad's going to happen to me, that there's someone out there like judging me. Like that's what it was like. Someone out there judging. No one's judging me. I get to choose. Mm-hmm. And I've dabbled in and out with spirituality and how I think about that. Sometimes that feels comforting. Sometimes that feels also another way of control, we'll dabble in and out, but I get to choose.
Mm-hmm. And that's the key.
Yeah.
And I think we should get into the fact that when you left your marriage, you weren't intending to leave the community. You just wanted out of your marriage, and how that was kind of twisted and used against you. And they thought that you were trying to leave the community, which probably ended up pushing you out because of all of that. So let's talk about that transition out and what made you realize that. I mean, we kind of touched on it, but really get into the psychology of when you realized I can no longer be part of the Hasidic community.
Yeah. So I think initially I was just so angry about the idea that these rabbis that I trusted, that knew me and knew what was going on, that they were willing to take all the children away from me. I was just absolutely devastated and angry. So I had a couple of months where I, on the weekends, would go into Manhattan and rent out a hotel room and go to a movie, uncover my hair, wear my jeans. I still have my first pair of jeans in my closet. But I was part of the community. Then I come back and get back changed into my clothes and put on my, my wig, and that was that.
Okay, so living on the fence.
Yeah. But then I was like, you know what? Maybe I could still be Orthodox, but not so strict Orthodox.
Mm-hmm.
I tried that for 2 years, from 2006 to 2018. Let me see, maybe I can make it work. There's something called modern Orthodox, where they're kind of more part of general American culture, but they still keep the rules. Let me see how that can work. I just, then at the same time, I was also going through my healing journey, a lot of trauma work and kind of unpeeling the layers, realizing the way I survived all those years was being very critical of myself, right? That's how I survived. So kind of unraveling all of that and starting, inner child work and connecting more kind of from a loving place.
Mm-hmm.
And that's when I was like, oh my gosh, I cannot live with these rules. I cannot. And I would and this sounds crazy, but I would sometimes force myself to break some of the rules just because I so badly wanted to get past that fear.
Yeah.
It's not real. But even though it felt real, even though I knew it wasn't real.
Yeah. What were some of the biggest hurdles for you? Just because we talked about the rules pretty extensively in the first episode, but now as an adult, after having all of these children, what were some of the rules that were really hard to just break and get over?
I would say for me, the hardest was how I dressed. It was really hard for me to go out with a tank top. It was really hard. It was so scary. You're taught, right? You're taught that men are these that you're going to harm men as a woman. You're going to harm men, and men are these predators, right? That you have to protect, always be the one who's responsible for protecting your body. So just that, it just feels so scary, right? Oh my gosh, if I go out with sleeveless, I'm the most immodest, I'm going to attract all these awful people, just kind of that was super hard for me. For some people, eating non-kosher meat is really hard because you're told that the food is going to taint your soul and you can never recover from that. But for me, it was stressing. Now, I'm fine. I'm past that. Though I will say that there was a lot of stress on looking good. So I would really be very diligent about losing weight between my babies and looking very thin. And that's something I grapple with. I feel that's still and I'm older now, post-menopause, and my body's different. And that was very ingrained in the culture. There's a ton of eating disorders.
Really?
Ton of eating disorder, yeah.
Wow.
It's a combination of the emphasis of how you look, right? And also control. That's one way you could have control in this environment where every bit of your life is being monitored.
So that's a really interesting factor. And I've noticed that in Mormonism as well, but I didn't think it would be as prevalent in your community or your former community, where you have to cover up so much. You mentioned in the previous episode, not even showing your collarbones. So just head to toe completely covered. You shaved your hair, you're wearing a wig, even sometimes a hat, but then you're still expected to be thin. And is that because you're supposed to be attractive but not seen? That seems like a really big contradiction there.
Yeah, right. Yeah, but I think you said it right. Well, you're supposed to be attractive, definitely attractive for your husband.
Yeah.
But then, yes, no one can see you.
Yeah, that's wow.
Yeah.
It's something that's so it's hard to wrap your brain around it, and I feel like that was a lot of my childhood too, was you're supposed to be beautiful so you attract the most worthy guy, but don't be too beautiful or you'll be seen as slutty or promiscuous or trying to attract attention, but not too much attention. And also something that you said really made me think. You said along the lines of you have to protect the man, right? Protect their virtue, but you're also a threat in which you could turn them into a predator. Like they can't control themselves. So they're so pure and virtuous until they see you, and somehow that makes them flip into something that could harm you.
Yeah.
That's a lot.
But that was kind of the message like under it. But yes, that's taken a long time to unravel for me. You know, I one of the first things I did back in 2018 is I went to San Francisco to Marlene Winell. She's kind of the founder of the term religious trauma. She wrote a book called Leaving the Fold. And there I met other people from other religions who had left, right? And it was so helpful for me. There were 2 Mormons there. I think both of them gay. There was like these older Catholic people. And remember, she was like, who's afraid of hell? And there were these old men. They were terrified. And it was like, we learn about hell like it's a thing for us. We don't call it hell. We call it Gehenna, right? So we're afraid of it. But it's not. We're much more afraid of like being killed in a car crash because you didn't eat the right food, right?
Oh, the threat is more in this life.
It's more in this life. Like there's something out there, but like it's not as bad as what could happen here, or it's like kind of temporary and you can repent at the last moment and then that won't happen. So but I remember like seeing people from other religions who had slightly different beliefs than me, not completely different, but slightly different. It was like, oh, wow, okay. And that kind of helped me unravel the things that I believed. And I remember this was before I left, 2017. I actually spoke to a former Mormon person. And she was telling me how she had a conversation with a friend and they were like, do you think it could be really true that of all the billions of people in the world, it's like us living in the United States in this particular state that are the only ones
who have it right?
I'm like, no, we're the ones, not you.
Yeah.
Like we're the ones. And then you open yourself up and you hear it's the same thing everywhere.
Everyone's being told the same thing.
Same thing. Yeah. It's a journey. It's a journey of a lifetime, I think, of being okay. My Substack, I just wrote about resting. That's kind of a goal of mine. Can I be okay without needing to contribute? I mentioned to you, I belong to this fellowship of other people who left their respective communities who are doing activism within their communities. And we had this conversation about, like, you can leave the community, but then you still act in that same way, like the selflessness and the overgiving and giving of yourself, because that's like that belief is still inside of you, even though you left those practices. Mm-hmm. So that's something like I watch out for, like, what am I still doing today that's so unhelpful? And like, what belief is it coming from in the past that's keeping me stuck in it?
That's such a good thing to point out, is the self-sacrifice, because of course it's not bad to do good things for other people, but at what cost to yourself? And that's usually where the difference is. So what I've noticed is within these high control groups, it's, oh, but they're doing so much service and this and that. And okay, but who's suffering to make that happen? So just an example, my mom would say that she felt she needed to go to the temple, those big castle looking buildings in Mormonism. She's like, I felt so guilty if I didn't go to the temple. And so I would try and go and do my best because that's how you get to the highest level of heaven in Mormonism. But my kids are home and they need their mom. And so why am I doing this? Or why am I sacrificing so much to spend all of my time at the church so that I can plan? She's like, we would have meetings to plan meetings. And she's like, we were just always there planning activities and give and give and give and give and give. Meanwhile, my kids are like, Mom, where are you? And so just learning to take care of yourself is so important when you leave a group like that. I would argue it's the first thing that you should tackle when leaving a high control group is just, what do you need? What makes you happy? What makes you feel at peace? Because when you are more of a complete person, you can show up better for other people in your life. You can be a better parent, better wife, better whoever. And all of that comes from learning how to just be, learning how, like you said, to allow yourself to just exist and not feel guilty for it.
Yeah. I will say, just like from women, and what you're saying about your mother just really reminds me of that. I was so taken aback by how I was treated by the rabbis. And it was like, I was in shock. But like in retrospect, years later, I'm like, yes, they imagine if every woman that was in an abusive marriage in that community was like, I had enough. I'm not putting up with this. The whole system would disintegrate.
It would collapse without the women.
It would collapse. So people are like, oh, do people admire you and come to you? I'm like, my story terrifies people because they're like, I was labeled immediately as crazy. It was like, people know I don't have a relationship with some of my kids. So people are like, oh my gosh, no. Like, I'll be quiet. I'll do what I'm told. So these communities really rely on the backs of women. I mean, not that men don't suffer, like men suffer, but I think with women, you have, the double layer, right? You have the overall community, but then you have what's often the patriarchal and misogynistic attitudes, of subservience and hard work.
Mm-hmm. Is there anything that you miss about the community, having been out for so long?
So there's like a flip side to everything, right? So there were rituals that I really enjoyed that is really hard to replicate if you're not in that kind of high control environment. Take Yom Kippur, right, which is a fast day, right? So the day before Yom Kippur, I'd be cooking 2 meals. Then you'd fast for 26 hours. And at the end of that, you're serving another meal. And there's a euphoria after the fast, right? Of like, right? You're feeling so connected spiritually. You're feeling so connected to people around you. I've been to other Jewish spaces. You cannot replicate that unless you're following a lot of strict rules of how you pray, what food you cook, how you prepare the food. So I'm kind of missing it less and less over the time. But that was one of the things that I was like, man, if only I can have that without all the restrictions. But it's almost like a drug-induced state in some ways. I will say that, on a Saturday, you have the 26 hours that you're off your phone and you're not allowed to think about work. It wasn't that much rest when you're a mom and you're like serving these like 5-course meals 3 times. But still, there was like a certain like completely cut off from like responsibility. That was nice. People always talk about the tight-knit community, the supportive community, and it's true. It's true. People aren't homeless. People aren't hungry. Like, if you can't afford food, there'll be a box of food for you. People will raise charity. I mean, my ex-husband had people raising money for his court case, right? Like, you'll be good. And that was one of the things that really scared me, actually, when I was like, I'm done. I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm losing that safety net.
Yeah, there's a lot of conditions to that love. And we talk about that a lot. So I'd like to get your opinion too, because people often say, well, I miss the community, and I can totally understand that and the benefits that come with that, as you just mentioned. On the other hand, it's a conditional love because when you're in, it feels unconditional. No matter what, there's going to be someone bringing a meal when, same in Mormonism, when you have a baby, there's going to be 6 casseroles at your door. But if you even consider leaving, maybe those casseroles go down to 1 or maybe 0 because they don't want to communicate or be in touch with or associate with people who are apostates or who have left the faith, which all of a sudden you're completely cut off, and that love is just sometimes even flipped, and they're angry at you, or they in your case talking bad behind your back, and so you feel like, wait a second, this total whiplash of what happened to this community that I thought loved me. And it's very, very conditional. And also I can understand on their part, because they're being taught people who leave are controlled by the devil or this, that, and the other thing that's terrifying. So I can understand why they would in some cases choose to cut you off. But it's hard to grapple with when you are faced with the reality that the community who you thought loved you really just was there because you were a part of what they believed in as well.
Yeah. And it's so manipulative, and I can't like not think about how connected they are in New York State to like the governmental, to the police, to the court system. You like all kind of also lose that protection. You know, they have like these little police forces. I don't know how to describe, like community watch, let's say, that receive funding from and they work together with the police. And when you're in the community, you kind of have that extra protection, you know, and they're looking out. Once you leave, especially once you complain against the school, which I did, it's like you become the targeted one. Like you're the one that's being followed. You're the one that they're checking out where you are and what you're doing. You know, it's like it really is turned against you, and it's scary. You know, it's scary when you've been taught like the importance of that community, right? And they're the only ones you can trust. But that's a lie. I'll just say this, that's a lie. That's not true. There are good people everywhere. You can manage on your own, and you don't need to rely on that. Yeah. And, you know, there's other ways to get support if you need it. Like it's a lie. I don't know how else to say it. It's not true. Like most of the other things you're taught. Like it's not true. Even as Jewish people who have experienced anti-Semitism and Holocaust, all that stuff, the world is not out to get me. Like I will say that the world is not out to get me. The world is not out to get you. And I think like that belief is so harmful and perpetuates so much of this dysfunction. Is it hard to leave and build a whole new life and a whole new way of thinking about the world? Yeah. It's not impossible.
Yeah. So what was that like when you finally broke free? I mean, you mentioned earlier, it's a process and there's ups and downs. And of course, you're always going to be healing and changing and shifting, which is great. So when you feel like you got to a place where you're like, all right, I'm good. I'm not living in fear anymore. I'm doing this advocacy work. What made you happy and at peace and feel fulfilled?
Yeah, so I would say I'm there now. Like once I decided I'm leaving that belief system, it took a little bit of time. I'm still working in the community, right? So it took a little bit of time till and then COVID happened, which was great because COVID, like people were in their houses for so long. And then by the time we went out, I was just like, whatever. Before COVID, I didn't want my neighbors to know. So I would like change in the subway. Like I like go out with like a skirt on top of my jeans and then like change and things like that. So even though like in my mind I had left, I was still like visibly people would see me and I would be practicing. But COVID was great for that. So I would say I'm there now where I'm not afraid like God is going to punish me for anything. You know, it's more now, I would say the work is more around kind of the psychological, like, can I feel comfortable just resting? Mm-hmm. And a lot of that is like trauma work, really, you know. But I mean, today, well, I have a little dog, which I could never even have imagined that. Like,
were pets not allowed?
Oh, no. We were terrified of dogs. No, pets were like absolutely positively not allowed. Taking up hobbies when I want to, because I feel like it, you know. This summer I started kayaking and water painting just because I like to do that. Like, you know, my little one's going to be 12 in October. And I'm thinking about, well, before you know it, he'll be an adult. And I never got to travel or like do things on my own. Like when I first left, I thought I was going to get married and I was going to start and now I'm like, like, I don't know. Like the idea of like just being a person traveling to different places when I want to and when it feels good to be able to do that. You know, one of my art forms that I enjoy is writing. I write personal essays, as I mentioned. I'm having a piece coming out soon, Huffington Post. That's been just joyful for me to learn how to write, but also be able to share my stories, which to me is in an art form and like an essay form. Can I say a sneak peek of what that piece is about?
Yes, please.
So, which we didn't discuss. The last few months before I left, I ended up on a chat room with Hasidic people, mostly men, and met up with a few of them and had relationships with them. Some of them online, some of them in person. And in my essay, I spoke about, like, of course, how I regret that, but also how I kind of needed to go through that in order to feel empowered enough to leave. And that's kind of another side of the community, which which I imagine may exist in Mormonism and in other spaces as well, where men are constricted so much that they somehow find ways to get around things, so there's a whole like underworld of people breaking the rules. And I'm not even talking about like the child sex abuse that's hidden, and that nobody will report to the police, because I'm not even talking about that. I'm talking about just these type of activities where you have married men, who are out there kind of finding outlets people will talk about. There was recently a prostitute that was like, those are my best customers. Like, people.
No way.
Yeah. It was like out there. New York it's New York, So that's what I write about in that essay, which is something that on the one hand, I'm so ashamed about, because I was like, my record was clear, till those last few months. But I will say that, and I don't think I write this in the essay, my ex was like refusing to let me leave, right? He didn't want me to leave. He was devastated that I left. And officially, if you're with another man, even though I didn't have intercourse, which is like a whole other weird thing, he's supposed to divorce you. He has to divorce you.
Oh.
Because you've been with another man. So in the back of my mind, I'm like, okay, then I'll be able to get divorced. Then he'll have to. I'll have no choice.
Yeah.
But it wasn't so simple. And ultimately, I stopped that and then left. And just was like an interesting, very scary time in my life. But that's coming out soon. I'm excited.
That's so fascinating. I'm excited to read it. And maybe, I don't know, I'm just curious, because you mentioned that you were ashamed for having relationships. Do you think that that's a well-placed shame, or do you think that that's a shame based on how you were raised?
Oh, of course. I remember speaking to my lawyer, and he was like, you're just like a typical woman who divorced and leaving a bad marriage. First you go to college, you get a college degree, then you get a job, and then you kind of
mess around,
find out if there's any other men in the world, and then you leave him. Like, that's what all women do. Like, he was just like, whatever. Yeah, of course. I begged him. I was like begging him for a divorce, and he was basically was hoping that if he'd keep me trapped with the children, he knew. And I always say the reason he said that was because he knew my connection to the children. If it would have been something else, he would have done something else. So to be trapped to that extent, yeah. I mean, it's not something I'm proud of, because it was just like, it was so scary for me. I was very scared also. Like, it was scary for me. It was confusing for me. It was like, what is going on? But on the other hand, it was like, go me, figuring out how to kind of navigate and figure this out. And ultimately, I feel like it was the last step I needed before I was able to be like,
Yeah. Well, you're figuring out how to be in the world. You're figuring out baseline. You're figuring out what you like, what you don't like. You're testing your own boundaries.
Yeah.
You're not only testing boundaries, you're figuring out what your boundaries are, because up until this point, someone else has told you what your boundaries were. And now you're like, wait, what am I okay with?
Absolutely. And like, I guess I'll share it. I don't speak about it publicly much, but even like, what is my sexuality when you never had a chance to explore, right?
Sure.
Like, even I'm going through that now, right? I haven't labeled myself or anything, but like, did I ever have an opportunity to even think about like dating a woman and what that would feel like?
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't like, it didn't even come within the realm of consciousness as a thing.
Yeah.
And like, looking in retrospect, like, oh my gosh, I remember having a crush on this girl and on that girl. Like, what did that mean? So like,
Yeah.
as old as I am, in some ways I'm just a teenager, right? 'Cause it's just been like 10 years since I left, right?
Yeah.
So I mean, those are the things that are beautiful, right? Because like, when you're in a community like that, there's no room for any exploration or any questioning. And now I'm free to do all that. I became ordained as an interfaith minister in 2020, which is amazing.
Yeah.
But also, like, I can question it every single day, and that's fine too. Like, nobody's holding me to like any, commitment or proclamation. And to me, that's the beauty of being human.
Mm-hmm.
We get to explore, we get to question, we get to be curious, we get to love, we get to hate, and we get to be like our own autonomous people moving through the world.
Yes. And that is exactly the individual sovereignty that we talk about here, which is just be you and be governed by yourself. Obviously, we live in a world where there's going to be other governances that we have to follow. But at the end of the day, the best that you can, to the best of your ability, doing things that make you happy, that aren't harming other people, what makes you feel happy and whole and at peace. And that is the goal, I think. If you can do that, I feel like you're winning at life.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I couldn't agree with that more. And again, with these communities, they rip that away from you.
Mm-hmm.
And to build that up is a journey. To build that up, and I agree what you said, like this taking care of yourself. What do I need? That's like the number one. It's so easy to get caught up in the theology and the theory, but really where the work's at is, what do I need, right? And how can I take care of myself? That's the key.
Yeah. So let's talk more about these organizations who are helping people get out of this theology, this mindset, and helping them get on their feet.
Yeah. So there's an organization. First of all, I mentioned Marlene Winell. I think still does work and has these online calls. I haven't been on one in a while. So Marlene Winell does, I think she calls it Journey Free, where she provides and wrote a book about deconstructing. A lot of it is very intellectual, but there's parts of it that are somatic and kind of body. So she does a lot of that great work. Journey Free is her website. In terms of leaving, the Hasidic community, there's an excellent organization called Footsteps, footstepsorg.org. They support people who leave the community. I was lucky. By the time I left, I had a college degree, I had an MBA. But for some people, they're coming there without a high school diploma. Young kids really need that support. They get the social support, but also the very, where do I go to live? Where do I find a house to live? How do I find a therapist who understands me? Like, when you're so in that community, you need someone to walk you through that path. So, they do a great job at that. I belong to an organization, and I have a fellowship through them, which it Rights and Religious Forum, which kind of takes this interfaith approach. And they support me as a leader who's going back into the community and doing work. And we have people from the Amish community, from the evangelical community, and several other communities, FLDS community, kind of when we work together. We have a retreat coming up in September that I'm excited about.
Yay.
So that's really, like, I very much believe that we need to, and you do this on your podcast, right? It's so similar, people's experiences. Yes,
Mm-hmm.
the rules are different. Yes, the experience is different, but the journey out is very similar.
Yeah.
And then I work for an organization called YAFFED, YAFFED.org, and I'm sure you'll link it. We're an organization that fight for education for these children. So many people, even if they leave, they're just like, whatever, but it's so important. I know what these kids have been through and continue to be through. It's just not fair when kids get deprived of an education. It's so hard for them to move on and move away. It's so hard. And you have people who leave the community and they're still stuck working for people in the community because they can't get other jobs because they don't have a high school diploma. It's just horrific beyond words. It traps people. Education was the key for me. For me, the first step was getting a college degree. That was the first step for me. I have my own agency, right? People will hire me. So, we work for that and have made tremendous progress here in the state, in New York State, and hopefully we'll continue.
Amazing. Everything that you're doing is so incredible. Thank you for standing up, for being a voice, for being a light for people, showing others who may be still in that there is a way out and there is happiness. There can be happiness on the other side. you're not forced to stay in this oppressive group for the rest of your life. You have options, you have choices. So thank you for just being that example for people.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. And people can find you and book you for your motivational speaking at beatriceweber.com, right?
Yes.
Amazing.
And I started a Substack. So if you sign up, you'll get my Substacks.
That's awesome. Yes. So we're going to link everything in the description. There's so many things that we talked about, so I'll make sure to put everything in there for anyone who's curious. And do you have any final thoughts oh, no, not final thoughts. Linda, listen. Let's get your second. You probably weren't anticipating a second one because we did 2 episodes. What's your second Linda Listen moment?
This one will be directed to people who are not in those communities. Okay. So, Linda, listen. When you see people who are still in these communities, it can be very infuriating, frustrating, easy to judge people. Like, try to approach them and to see their lives with as much compassion as they can. Yes. It's not easy being stuck there.
Yes, I'm so glad that you brought that up, because that is the last thing that we want to do here, is to make people judge and further, I don't know if victimize is the right word, but not approach these people with love and compassion, because that's the whole goal. Is we're trying to raise awareness, not so you can be like, yeah, you guys are awful, but to be like, oh, I can understand where you're coming from. I can more fully understand the boundaries of what you're living in and the perspectives which you're coming from. I think it's just so helpful to shed light on these situations for the compassionate side. So I'm so glad that you said that. Do you have any other final thoughts before we go?
I think that's it.
All right. Well, thank you for being here. Really appreciate your stories.
Yeah, thank you.
So everyone, if you're watching, please make sure to leave those comments down below. It makes our guests feel very welcome. I love reading them, and it also boosts the algorithm and helps more people see this. Of course, liking and sharing is great. Being a subscriber and advocate for our guests is also amazing. It's so cool to see how fast we've been able to grow in 2 years. It's honestly mind-blowing. We also started a sister channel, which is just for clips. If you want to see some of our previous episodes that you may have missed, we're cutting out about 8 to 10-minute chunks that you can just see in bite-sized pieces. And we also are going to start giving sneak previews to episodes that have yet to be released on our main channel. So you can go subscribe to that. I think it's just Cults to Consciousness Clips. I should know the username. Pretty sure it's at Cults to Consciousness Clips. And if you want to become a patron, you can do that. Our newest patrons, we have Patricia and Karen. Thank you so much for being a part of that. And if you like this episode, definitely check out these 2 below. Probably going to be Chavie's episode, Johannen's episode, and also make sure and go and watch the very first episode we did with Beatrice on the beginning part of her life. Thank you so much for being here, and until next time, follow your highest excitement, be conscious, and be well.